Well, I would, excuse me, I would like to welcome everyone to our virtual Zoom meeting here, which I hope may be the last, um, as we finish out the year of Thursday, May 5th, 2022. Again, can we all pledge the, can we all stand to salute the American flag, the Pledge Allegiance, Paul? Okay. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay. All right. Dr. Lutz, I'll turn it over for an introduction of our speaker.
Yeah, so I asked Ryan Ruff, I'll introduce Ryan a little bit, although I think most people on the Zoom call know him, but we have, as you all know, because we've learned this, right, in this state, when we have an enacted budget, the governor has the ability to put a lot of things into that budget other than money. And this year in particular, there's some very interesting things that happened in the state budget for the first time in a while, actually the second time in a while. It was less about the money and more about those other things. So because this is a group that's done a lot of advocacy and we advocated for certain specific things, I thought it would be a good idea to share with this group what actually was enacted. In other words, what came to be the state budget shortly after April 1st, which is the deadline. So Ryan Ruff, who is presently our deputy superintendent, and one of the things that Ryan oversees for the agency is the business office, but he's the deputy superintendent for management services. So he actually oversees a lot of things in the agency. He's been in the agency for the past 7 years. Prior to coming to Eastern Suffolk BOCES, Ryan was the assistant superintendent for business at the Plainview Old Bethpage Central School District for 9 years. But he's also worked in other school districts. He worked in Sag Harbor. In a prior life, he worked in Cold Spring Harbor, at one point. And Ryan is also very active and has been in leadership roles with school business official organizations, both locally and statewide. So he believes in strong business practices that create efficiencies while protecting taxpayer funds, which is hugely important for public education, which is publicly funded in this state. Ryan also the board has appointed Ryan effective July 1st as the chief operating officer of the agency. So at that point, he'll step out of that role and into the role of chief operating officer. So in a little less than 2 months, but we're not exactly sure how many days because we're not counting days. Anyway, so I will turn it over to Ryan. Somebody who's sharing are you sharing yourself, Ryan?
Yeah, I'll share the screen myself. And thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to present at tonight's meeting. Fascinating to me, very interesting to me is the state budget when it comes out and what's in it and what's out of it. We have a bunch of state organizations that do a really phenomenal job explaining it. I'll give it my best tonight, and I'm going to try to focus a lot on the students that are joining us. So I apologize if some of this is a repeat for you or something that you've heard before, but I really do like to speak to the students and try to do it in a way that makes as much sense as possible, given the topic. And the other thing I just want to share is this presentation. We put together the PowerPoint in a little bit different fashion. So you'll see some transitions in the screens, and it's called morphing. So it's new, it's different. I thought I'd give it a shot to see how it works for us. I hope it doesn't mess anybody up here while you're watching it, but it may look a little bit different, but I was trying to just be a little original with this. So bear with me as we change slides. So just to begin, am I good to kick it off, Julie?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, great. And if anybody has any questions during it, please feel free to speak up and interrupt me because I'm doing this from a laptop. I just have my screen showing the PowerPoint. So just speak right up. If I don't hear you, talk a little bit louder and I'll pause and answer any questions you may have. So really, we're just going to get into what was in the budget. What do we see as some of the impact and what wasn't in the budget? Because that's almost as important, especially to BOCES for us. The very first thing to highlight is the overall increase. Amazing amount, $2 billion increase. To put it to compare it, the state aid from New York State's around $30 billion. To see an increase of this size is very unusual. We had a similar increase last year, which was the largest increase in history. And we anticipate another increase in similar size next year. And the reason for that has to do directly with foundation aid. Foundation aid makes up about 2/3 of the overall state aid that a school district receives and supports, in many school districts, the majority of the annual school budget. So when you see large increases in foundation aid, it's a good opportunity to support public education and even a chance for school districts to consider adding new programs or taking advantage of programs that they perhaps couldn't afford in the past. So for the state to come forward with this really large increase in foundation aid of $1.5 billion has had a very nice impact on school districts. And I'll get into which school districts saw the biggest increases in just a moment. The other area that we saw increases in about $540 million are what referred to as expense-driven aids. So foundation aid's the largest category, but there's other areas such as aid that would go to a school district for increased costs related to special education, or aid related to a school district for transporting students, or aid related to textbooks or computers. So all of those are what we refer to as expense-driven aids, because if you spend the money, school districts get a certain percentage back, or or money back based on how many students that they get related to the expense. So that, in combination with the increase in foundation aid, was over $2 billion, which again was really, really helpful for schools. So what did this really mean to Long Island specifically, right? So we know what the amount was for the state, but if we look specifically to Long Island, we can see that about a half a billion dollars of new money came into the island for public education. And if you look at the bar graph to the right, you can see the distribution of foundation aid increases and what types of school district the increases went to. So the blue lines are the high wealth districts, and you can see the high wealth districts mainly got an increase of just 3%. Or if you look further to the right, you can see increases of 10% or even more than 20%, were really more directed to low wealth and mid wealth districts. So the nice part about that is more money went to the districts with the more significant needs. And you can see increases in a school district like Brentwood of upwards of $30 million. And over a 2-year period, they received $60 million. If you look at last year and this year, round numbers, and we anticipate similar numbers in the future. So with the great support and the appreciation for our elected officials for allocating such large amounts in their budget, we still like to point out that Long Island educates about 16% of the students, and yet we only receive about 13% of the money in terms of state aid. So that's a difference of 3%, right? And the reason for that is that the formulas don't only look at enrollment. The formulas that determine how much aid a school district gets also looks at the wealth of the districts. And even though we have our share of low wealth districts on Long Island, upstate New York also has low poverty districts, which in some cases, the majority of their school budget is supported by the form of state aid. And also they don't have many of the programs that we see in opportunities for students on Long Island. So we do like to just point this out, not that we aren't appreciative, but there is a difference because of this of about $1 billion leaving Long Island that could otherwise be spent to support public education and ultimately reduce property taxes. So that is just something that we are aware of and that we pay attention to. And you can see kind of the difference amount of state aid per student that is spent on Long Island versus the rest of the state. So foundation aid was something that was promised as a result of a court case many, many years ago. And what this chart shows is how many school districts were underfunded in this category. And what it really was there was a court case that determined the minimum amount of money of support that should be given by New York State towards the public education. If you go back about 10 years ago, there were 540 school districts of almost 700 school districts in New York State that were underfunded according to the formulas. And even today, with the massive amount of increases that we've seen over the last 2 years, we still have 384 school districts that are not fully funded. The good news is that last year in the budget, there was a commitment by the governor to fully fund foundation aid over a 3-year period of time. So in next year's budget, if the state's finances stay in relatively good shape, which they're trending in that fashion, the bar for next year in the 23-24 school year will go down to 0 because all school districts would have received full funding. And then it will probably resort back to expense-driven aids or any other changes that they could make to the formula moving forward. So just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the new things or new funding sources in addition to expense-driven aids and foundation aid in this year's budget. So the RECOVES grant is a recognition that the pandemic has had an impact on our students. This allocation of $100 million is focused on the well-being and to address learning losses that has been caused as a result of COVID. So in addition, this $100 million is an opportunity for school districts to expand their mental health programs to support students who have really struggled throughout the past few years. The formula and the grants will be awarded based on student needs. So there will be a measure that identifies where the dollars can best be utilized. And it does require the school districts or BOCES, as a BOCES, we're eligible for this funding as well, to match the dollars that are received. The way we anticipate that this will be structured is we'll be able to use existing funds that we already have allocated towards this. So the matching component of it, we don't see as a big obstacle for school districts or BOCES. When we apply for this money, we would utilize it to support the region and make sure that school districts, some of the new BOCES programs, because of this funding source, would support the children in the Eastern Suffolk BOCES component districts. So again, just to the last point, even though it's a matching grant, we can utilize money that we have generated from state aid or federal funds. Another big push at the state level for the past few years has been a focus on universal pre-K.
So
And
Ryan, can I stop you? Can you just back up and talk about with that RECOVES grant? Like, what's the difference that schools have to go through between like getting money in aid versus money that comes in a grant?
Yeah, so in a grant situation, there'll be an application process that would be submitted by districts interested in trying to access this $100 million, whereas in state aid, funds are just actually directly sent from the state government into the bank accounts of the school districts for support. So there's some work on the front end. There's some proof that needs to be provided along the way. And then there's requests for money during the grant application and closure process.
Thank you.
So we often think of public education starting in kindergarten, but there's been a large push to expand the number of seats that we have students attending school beginning at 4 years of age. There's been an additional $100 million allocated in the budget to help accomplish this. So many school districts have programs. Fortunately, it's not eligible for all of the students. Sometimes that's restricted by the number of available classrooms that a school district has, or their overall budget. If it's not universal, sometimes you hear the term universal, which would mean all children, 4-year-olds in the state would receive this. One of the other obstacles for school districts to pull off universal pre-K is the fact of transportation for 4-year-olds, or dedicated buses for 4-year-olds aren't eligible for transportation aid. So that puts the full expense of transporting the students to the school on the districts. And sometimes that can be a very large expense and cause for a school district not able to run the program. The good news is that the state has committed to the future an additional $250 million to see expanded programs. Again, have to look at transportation aid, have to look at space to make sure that we can accomplish more and more 4-year-olds attending school. When they do that, once they come into kindergarten, they really have a really strong foundation. And also the support can help provide equity across communities, and sometimes wealthier communities, parents can afford expensive daycare programs to help students get that head start for kindergarten. One of the areas of the budget that I think got a lot of conversation was transitioning. I think we have about 50,000 school buses in New York State, and they throw off a lot of pollutants into our atmosphere, right? So we have diesel buses get 6 or 7 miles to a gallon, hundreds of thousands of miles traveled every single day by these buses. And really a push in New York State to help preserve our environment is to switch from mostly diesel or gasoline buses to what's referred to as a zero emissions bus or an electric bus. So one of the challenges with this is because electric technology is fairly new. The cost of a school bus that we ride on today is about $120,000 to $150,000. An electric school bus can cost upwards of $300,000 to $350,000 and even more. So with a school district that has limited resources and funds, it's very challenging for them to just buy an electric bus as opposed to a regular gasoline school bus. And they also have to consider a lot of the infrastructure behind in the bus garage to make sure they have charging stations, that they have enough power supply that can be run actually to the bus garage. There's some places that may not have enough power in that location to support charging hundreds of buses overnight. So that's another consideration. But the good news is we have many years to be able to accomplish this. So by July of 2027, all new school buses must be zero emissions. So I'm hopeful over the course of the next few years that the technology, that there's major investments in this because they see that the sales for new school buses are going to go in this direction, and the cost of electric buses come much more in line to what a regular school bus costs today. And then by July of 2035, which may seem like a long ways off, but it's good to pick a point in time to try to accomplish this goal for our environment. All school buses must be electric school buses or zero-emission school buses, which means gasoline and diesel buses would no longer be able to be utilized. So that gives us some time to prepare and for the technology to catch up with it. But ultimately, there'd be a lot less pollutants as a result of this pretty unique funding. Speaking of which, so there has been $500 million earmarked in Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Bond Act. And a bond act means that the state would actually borrow money to help support this initiative moving forward. So very unique part of the state budget this year. Another thing
Before you go on to this, can you
Sure.
back and talk? I know that you have, a lot of interaction with business officials across the state. Talk about, some of the concerns that you're hearing from your state colleagues related to the zero-emission school buses. I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that the environment is really important. And as you said, school buses put out a lot of pollutants. And there's some planning time there, 2027 for every new purchase being zero emission and 2035 for every school district only operating zero emission. But what are the real challenges other than the ones you talked? The buses cost more money. I mean, what if you're a district that's planning on, rebuilding your bus garage next year and has all of these plans to create this wonderful bus garage to support diesel buses. But I think there's other concerns, right, in certain places of the state related to electric buses.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest concerns is in some rural areas in upstate New York, buses can travel upwards of a couple hundred miles per day. So the technology is nowhere near to be able to support that distance and even charging, in between. So there's some real concerns of that. Also, electric buses in current technology, when the temperature gets below zero, they lose a lot of their abilities as well. So they can't run very well when the temperature gets low, which often happens to in upstate New York. Was sitting next to somebody at a state conference recently who was thinking like a couple of weeks was getting ready to repave and do new curbing in a bus parking lot, right? So large, think of a massive amount of pavement work to be done. And they were kind of a little bit of a standstill. Do they have to run conduits underneath the parking lot to include plug-in stations into the future for future expansion? So a lot of logistics, lot very tricky. And as I kind of briefly mentioned, there's actually places where they did an analysis and there's not enough electrical supply where their location of their bus garage actually is to actually provide the power to charge all their buses overnight. So if they went full electric, there would have to be additional work done on the actual utility poles outside of the bus garage to provide more power in that actual area, which was a little bit interesting. So they had some concerns related to that as well. Others, Julie, that you can think of that I may have missed?
No, thank you for that. Lots of every wonderful initiative like that is so much more complicated than at first glance, right?
Yep.
Ryan, can I have a question?
Absolutely.
Ryan, there was a student in Sable that did a study on the infrastructure of our Long Island and said that they would not be able to handle all of the electric cars. And now you're talking about buses and whatnot. Is there any report that you're aware of that says that they can handle it as far as the increase of electric power?
Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit early to know if that's the case. Often when I look at this, I look and see, the power source that's right, because it requires additional power, right? If we're not using gasoline or diesel or a fossil fuel, we have to look at the source of the electricity that's being supplied on the grid. In some cases, we have natural gas being burned to produce power, or we have coal plants in some cases to produce power. So although the bus is now converted from not running on diesel, it doesn't mean the electricity being provided to the bus hasn't done that. Now, nuclear, right, is not a fossil fuel, and it's a way of producing power, but there's other risks obviously associated with that. So Fred, we haven't. I think that's too new for us to even know the answer to that, but certainly something for us to consider as we move forward. You know, if we're successful with some of the offshore windmills that I think is starting to happen, that would provide a really nice green power resource to Long Island to help offset some of those concerns, I believe. All right, so another item in the budget that was interesting, and for those of you looking at that picture, that's a picture inside of our network operations center over at MTC. So if you recall, one of the big projects we've had in the last few years was moving our computer room out of the old Sherwood building into an agency-owned building. And on the left, you can see one of the row of racks that we have for our computer supplies. And on the right is some of the, I think those are some of the transfer switches in association with the generator, which I'm actually on the next slide. But one of the things that really came to the forefront, we knew that there were parts of the state that was really struggling for high-speed internet, which probably many of us just take for granted. I've been on calls with certain school districts on the North Fork, and I've been not on calls, like Zoom meeting calls, and I've been amazed that it was around dismissal time, and they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to turn off my video now and only go over voice because at this time of day the internet connection isn't very good because all the students come out of school and they start using their phones, and other people start connecting to their home networks." And I was amazed by that. I wasn't thinking that would be a challenge for them. But when we because of the pandemic, we went to the remote learning format, there were many areas in the state that couldn't operate like much of Long Island did. So that was a priority for our elected officials. They wanted to make sure that in places that are underserved or unserved altogether with no internet speed, that we were able to expand the broadband into those areas of the state. So an additional $1.4 billion, most of which is going to be supported through federal funds, about $1.1 billion through federal funds, is there to increase speeds. There's a little bit of talk about if it's enough bandwidth. So the state would require 25.3 megabytes per second, which would support normal I guess download speeds. But as I'm talking to you right now, doing a Zoom meeting and streaming a PowerPoint, my wife is in the other room streaming video on her phone, and my daughter is in the other room. Actually, I give her credit. She's studying for her math test right now, so she's not using any video. But those are some of the challenges. If you have multiple streams of data, it would not be able to be handled by what the state said is the minimum of 25.3 megabytes per second. And there's been some analysis done by the New York State School Boards Association thinking that minimum speed should be set at 100, so you could have multiple family members participating in remote learning at the same time. So I'm assuming more to come on that, but again, large amounts of money being allocated to address some of this. As I mentioned, $300 million in state funds, and a brand new office is being created at the state level to try to coordinate this initiative and create those regulations. So the picture to the right here is just inside of our generator. So if we lose power to our Islip campus, this generator would support it. So not all of the computers in the agency would lose it. So we wouldn't have downtime there. So one of the other things that aren't necessarily money driven, but is a recognition again by the state trying to be responsive and supportive of some of the issues that we're faced with, but on Long Island as well as upstate, we have significant staffing issues, almost to critical levels where certain programs can't be run, or you've heard of shortages with bus drivers, shortages with aides, shortages with teachers in certain parts of the state, at really critical levels where programs and services aren't being able to be delivered to students. So there was a response by our elected officials. And the first thing that they did was change the vesting requirements, meaning how long someone has to participate in a retirement system before they're able to see some of those benefits, from a 10-year period down to a 5-year period. So in tier 4, it was a 5-year period until you were vested. And in an effort to try to save money, tiers 5 and 6 were created, and they increased that to 10 years. Well, thinking is that some people opt not to join or go into these professions or work in school districts or BOCES because they don't want to wait 10 years to be vested. And so people can look more short term in today's marketplace. And we're seeing a nice support to try to recognize that with the retirement systems. Also, a 1-year waiver. So when people retire, if they're not age 65, they can only earn up to $35,000 a year before they run the risk of not being able to take, run the risk of losing part of their retirement income. So for 1 year, there's been a waiver for this cap. It's referred to as the $35,000 retirement income cap. So employees, teachers, bus drivers, administrators, and both school districts and BOCES can go back to work and earn above that to try to fill some of these positions that are very challenging for us to fill. So that's going to run through June of 23. So again, trying to address some of the critical staffing issues that we have. And the second to last topic I wanted to get into a little bit was a part of the law referred to as the open meetings law, and some of the changes in the state budget, right? So you think of budget, you think of numbers, and now we're talking about some of the other things in this. But they just to back up for a second, public business needs to be conducted in the public so that people can attend a meeting and view what is being voted on by board members, and what's on business agendas and what action is taking place must be done in the public for the public to see. And obviously during a pandemic, that's very challenging. How do you have that? So some rules and laws were created related to the open meetings laws where people could do that through Zoom. And we took advantage of that for a few months at Eastern Suffolk BOCES. But post-COVID, we have some additional changes to the open meeting laws where a board member could attend through a video conference if certain conditions are met. So there must be a significant or unexpected factor or an event which would mean that they could not attend the meeting. Some of these things that would be considered would be a disability or an illness or the requirement to care for others, and some of the other significant factors. And then the board must adopt a resolution. I mean, they have to act in the public on accepting a board member being at a remote location. So some nice recognition of the technology can have people meet. We all agree, or at least I think most of us agree, that meeting in person is much more effective, but in extenuating circumstances, the law has been adapted so that we can get the most participation at our meetings. One of the, in the beginning, one of the interesting things that allowed people to meet remotely would allow the public to come into actual people's homes. So there was a change that would not have physical locations being open to the public, meaning if one of our board members was coming in remotely, that they didn't have to allow people to come into their house, which was in the initial requirement.
Kathy Romano has a question.
Hi, Kathy.
So, hello, Ryan. So in the open meetings law, is it a one-time adoption by the board for the resolution that somebody appear remotely, or does that have to be adopted every time someone is remote? Do we
Wait,
know?
that's a good question. When I read the Gercio memo, so it's a memo from our
Mhm,
law firm.
mhm.
I think it's a one-time adoption. So you must have a public discussion about the fact that you are going to adopt this policy to allow within those specific parameters for people to work remotely. So for example, Eastern Suffolk BOCES presently has a policy that does allow board members to join remotely with much more restrictive categories, because that's what was allowed pre-pandemic. And that includes, that we have to post that place as an official meeting site, that person has to have both audio and visual connectivity in order to be, considered part of the voting quorum in the meeting. So, so it would be a public discussion. So in case any part of our public that comes to our meeting says, no, we don't want people to be able to join your meetings remotely. So you would then pass a policy and people would have to meet those requirements. By the way, I don't have it in front of me, but I think, and Ryan, maybe that people who are remote are not considered part of the quorum. So the quorum are the folks who are in the room, and so in order to do business, you need to have a certain percentage of the board. So for those who are not familiar with the word quorum, so you have to have a certain percentage of the board in order to do business. And so the people who are remote are not part of that quorum. So even though there's flexibility for people to join remotely, it's not written, these flexibilities are not written in a way to encourage people to be remote, which is a very different change than the flexibility that we've seen on the books for the last couple of years. Now, our board has been back in person for quite a while, but there's been a lot of flexibility for folks to join remotely if they needed to. We've had board members do that, either because they were sick, they couldn't pass the COVID, protocols of feeling healthy and well. We've had people join, they were out of town, and in the past they wouldn't have been able to join, but they were able to join because there were remote options. So, provided a lot of flexibility for people to get to meetings. But this, New York State takes very seriously this open meetings law. There's actually a
Committee.
Committee on Open Government that spends a lot of time weighing in on these types of questions. And, and as Ryan said at the beginning, it's, public business is meant to be done in the public. Which is why there's a lot of guidance and guidelines and parameters on how that needs to happen.
Yeah, the quorum must be present at the physical location. The vote of the remote board members can still count, but you have to have the quorum present, is the way I interpret the memo. And something for us to think about, because we need some written procedures related to this as well. So we can reach out and see, maybe New York State School Boards has some things developed, or Erie One BOCES related to this. Okay, just some more. The last slide, in terms of new information to share, is what was not in the budget, which was in some cases a little bit surprising to us. There's lots and lots of talk about raising the BOCES CTE salary cap. For the last 30 years, the dollar amount has been set and the aidable amount at a pretty low margin. Salaries have increased over the last 30 years. We were advocating to see if we could get some additional support for our component school districts to have when they send students to our CTE programs. And that was not in the budget, although there was so much talk about it and just wide support for it that we were a little surprised that couldn't happen. Also, The next bullet about increasing the capital outlay. Again, a lot of talk about this. This dollar amount set at $100,000 threshold. And really what it means is a school district can do a $100,000 project and get aided the next year. They were looking at increasing this by quite a bit because, again, you can't do much of a project anymore for $100,000, especially with the way inflation has been and the cost of building materials going up. And that did not move forward either. Another item was funding for prior year adjustments. So what happens sometimes is that a clerical error is made when certain reports are filed and school districts will miss a deadline, but other legislation can come in place to approve that funding, even though an error was made past the deadline. And they go into a category referred to as prior year adjustments. I think statewide, there's about $300 million of projects that fall in this category. Usually there's about $20 million in the budget to support prior year adjustments. You can run the numbers. You can see it's going to take for a long time if you're on the bottom of that list to get your money, but some money at a future point in time is better than no money. So there was $0 allocated in this budget for that, which was unique given the amount of funds seen as available. And the other thing just to mention was there was a request to repeal from some of the state transparency reporting that was supported by the previous governor and frequently viewed as a duplicate request for specific financial information. There was thinking that there may be support for repealing this additional burden on frequently business offices to have to work to fill out this extra reporting requirement that we're not so sure too much is actually done with. So kind of pushing through an efficiency lens, not through not wanting to be transparent. Everybody wants to be transparent, but there are multiple other reports that are submitted to the state and to the boards and to the community related to transparency, where this additional burden was really just duplicate work, and we thought that that was going to get changed, but it did not either. So just four things I wanted to highlight that were not included in the budget. And with that being said, any questions? Oh, Julie, I think you're muted.
Yeah, if you have questions, you can either raise your hand virtually or in your little Zoom box, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Oh, wait, we have, was that you, Catherine? That was Kathy. Anybody have any questions?
That's me, Julie. I'm not sure there are students on. So my question was really going to be more about why, for the students and the staff, why the CTE salary cap is so important to us, and what the holdup is in Albany about trying to move that, because that's always a concern for us and our staff in order to get increased students, but we seem to always fall on dead ears.
Yeah, we do have a couple of students on.
So can you explain to them why that's important?
Sure. Yeah, Ryan, you want to, well, so let me try and then Ryan can clean up my mess. So school districts who send students to BOCES, like let's say BOCES career programs, because I'm thinking both the students who are on go to a career program, they get reimbursed for some of the cost of sending you to programs, right? And that includes the cost of some of the cost of the teacher, right? And about 30 years ago, they determined that a reasonable amount of teacher salary to reimburse was $30,000, right? So the state would reimburse up to $30,000 of the cost of a teacher, because believe it or not, 30 years ago, that was a pretty reasonable number for the cost of a teacher. And that amount has not changed since then. So now, surprise, surprise, teachers make more than $30,000. So there has been a push, especially in the last 5, 6, 7 years, where there's been lots of support for career training for high schoolers, especially the last 2 years when there was lots of money, that the state had to support public education. We were very, very hopeful that some of that money would now, with both the recognition that career training for high schoolers is vitally important, and the fact that there was money, we were very hopeful that they would finally adjust that, maybe up to, I think the proposal actually was kind of to increase it over the course of several years to a number like $60,000 or something. Now, my understanding as to why it wasn't funded is because they had a lot of other places that they did put funding. As Ryan, did a really good job of talking about, like, all of the money that came. A lot of it went to foundation aid, which is the biggest bucket of money. And then a lot of money went to other places like pre-K funding and that. I don't want to say it's not important, but I will say when we look at how many students go to BOCES career training programs versus how many students there are in the state, it's still a relatively small piece of that student pie. And so when they were determining where to allocate money, that wasn't one of them. It certainly was not a recognition. It wasn't that they don't recognize the importance of career training programs. And, a different way to look at it is the districts who send us students got a ton of money to be able to do that, right? And especially as Ryan shared, right, our lower wealth districts that happen to send us a lot of students for career and tech ed, they got a lot of money. So they have more money to expend on sending students to career and tech ed. So in other words, instead of lowering the cost of the product, they raised people's salaries so they can have more money to spend on the product. It's, it's a different way to look at it. Tracy Davy, CTE is important for schools. Accountability ratings under the Every Student Succeeds Act ESSA of 2018. Was that in response to something Ryan said, Tracy?
Just the whole topic, that we would hope that since Ira Schwartz used to say what they count gets done, and hopefully they'll fund it too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I can add to just a little bit to that is I do feel a very frustrating thing for New York State is that aid category that I spoke about referred to as expense-driven aids, because every year that costs them $300 to $500 million, and it's not new for them, right? They don't get to say, hey, look, I just sponsored RECOs, or I just sponsored more money for pre-K, or it's just money that's out the door because expenses with transportation went up, or expenses with building aid went up, or expenses for excess cost aid or special ed aid went up. So I think that may play part of it. We don't hear that, but to change the formula for expense-driven aids to increase at an even higher rate is something that I think elected officials are going to be reluctant to do.
Yeah.
Ryan, a question. You had made mention about the buses must be zero emission, and in upstate New York charging stations. Here on Long Island also, as we move on forward, do you feel in the future school districts are going to have a bond issue for charging stations? Because, and when will the new purchase begin that we have to purchase electric cars, for BOCES and the school districts around?
Yeah, they absolutely would have to find the money somewhere to add charging stations. One of the most, and remember, on Long Island, many of our districts outsource transportation
Right.
to some of these larger companies who are going to have to raise capital to make these changes. And the way they raise capital is by charging more to their customers, and their
Yeah.
customers are school districts, which are ultimately taxpayers. But they would have to, I'm thinking of Riverhead, which has one of the most impressive school transportation yards that I've seen. And you can see dozens and dozens and dozens of buses. It looks like probably close to 100 buses, I would say, lined up in a row. And the cost to put in, individual charging stations and then just the power draw that these big batteries would have overnight, to me, is pretty substantial. So a lot of logistics go into it. And I think that's part of the thinking why they made this mandatory 12, 13 years from now. So, not only to give us time, but the people who made these rules will probably long be gone by then.
Right.
So they're saying, what were these people thinking that did this?
And I guess a lot of delayed openings also.
Yeah, exactly. But it's very costly. Now, if there's 50,000 buses that are needed to be replaced, and they're all going to be electric buses, we know that production will drive costs down, right? So that's what we know will happen. And when you put $500 million out there through an environmental bond act, again, that money comes from somewhere, right? And that's the taxpayer ultimately. But again, it's not going to be enough money to address all the logistical things, to your point, Bill.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Ryan about the budget or any of those other lovely things that were put in the budget? Okay, so we have a thank you and an evaluation. Bill, I'll let you do the thank you, and then I'll talk about
Sure.
our.
All right. I just would like to thank our legislative committee for their attendance this year. We made it through 2021, 2022 school year. We're looking forward to 2022, 2023 with in-house meetings. All of our meetings were, we kept everyone informed in today, and it's so important in today's times to understand the political process that we went through, that we are going through. Dr. Lux, I'm thankful to you because of your support in allowing this committee when we first started it. This committee at every meeting meets the needs of our students, and I feel the communities that BOCES represents, because we brought in people from all over Long Island, constituents, in all political ends. And I think, the students, I'm going to surely miss you as a partner in advocating for our young students to become active citizens in a political process, as they go forward in their adult years. So I think the committee had a lot of meaning. I appreciate your partnership with myself and all the other administrators, students, teachers, faculty, staff, parents. So we're looking forward. We're going to miss you.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say how many days, but we're going to miss you.
Listen, Bill, I appreciate not only your vision for this committee, but your perseverance and the work you had to do to convince me to get it started however many years ago. So yes, thank you, Bill. Bill has a passion really for helping all of us understand the legislative process. This committee does a good job of bringing folks in to help us do that. We are going to send out an evaluation. We pay a lot of attention to that evaluation. We might add a few new things, like maybe who would you like to hear from, things like that, so that we know what works and what kinds of things you like to hear at this legislative committee. So, and we're going to send that out to anybody who came to any meeting this year. That's one of the reasons we ask for folks' email addresses. So we'll email that out, and it doesn't matter if you only came to one meeting or you came to all of the meetings. your input is important and helps paint the picture for what the future will look like. So that being said, 7:58, 2 extra minutes to do something lovely with. Miss Kathy Romano having a birthday tonight. We are honored that you chose to spend your birthday with us, Mrs. Romano. I hope you got takeout.
Thank you so much. Actually, I made tortellinis myself.
Happy birthday, Kathy.
Happy birthday, Kath.
Thank you all. Thank you. I
Bye,
think
Ann.
you guys are so important.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd rather
Thanks.
celebrate with you.
Everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul Wimmer, for your technical support and your patience with us over all of the months. So anyway, have a great evening, everybody. Thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks for the
Good night,
baby cake,
everyone.
Kathy
Have a
Massey.
great summer and a safe summer.
All right, thanks, Ryan. Good job.
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Good job, Brian.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.